Okay, I think that everybody is here for crowd design session number 10. We are coming to you from our Insane Children Discord server. Links in the description below if you would like to follow along at AmericanMcGee.com. There is a section with all of the community ideas and suggestions. If you would like to join us for a future crowd design session, consider becoming a patron. I believe it unlocks at $5 per month and above. It gives you Patreon access, which gives you Discord access. We are going to be talking about in-game ideas and suggestions for Alice Asylum today. And depending on our time, we're also going to review the ongoing crowd design efforts around the Cheshire Kitten plush and a recent post over on dealing with the start of the game in an area we're referring to as shock. So without further ado, if you do have something, if you're in the chat here on Discord and you have something you want to add and join us, if you have a microphone, then be sure to use the microphone emoji in the chat. And I think that's about it. If our mods have got anything they want to add.
Hello. Hopefully nothing goes wrong today.
Yeah, just hi to everyone, and yeah, let's hope for no technical issues. Let's go.
Yeah, for those of you listening in, I've just spent the last 30 plus minutes trying to get my internet functional because the Great Firewall here in China is trying to make life difficult for us on all new levels. So pretty interesting. All right, let's jump right in. So we are looking at the ideas for gameplay ideas for Alice Asylum over in the suggestions section at AmericanMcGee.com. Again, the links for that are in the description below. We're going to start off with the number one, and someone has suggested a magic 8-ball or fortune cookies that contain advice or sayings from the Cheshire Cat. Could also be origami animals with messages. I think 2 points that jump out at me immediately is I don't know that magic 8-balls existed in the Victorian era, and I don't know that fortune cookies, which I think I know they were invented in the US. I don't know that they had made it over to or had even been invented yet at that time in history. Anybody have any other thoughts on this?
This one's sounding like a pretty hard no from the get-go, just to
yeah,
because of
it says here
the dates and
says
stuff.
here that it says here that fortune cookies were invented in San Francisco in some time around 1918. So we're about 100 years off. And so that's not the best suggestion. I'm also kind of wondering why we would use a magic 8-ball or a fortune cookie or any sort of device that isn't the Cheshire Cat to repeat sayings from the Cheshire Cat when in Wonderland we could just have direct access to the actual Cheshire Cat. That seems a bit odd.
That's what I was going to say.
It sounded like one of those suggestions for the sake of suggesting.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd one. On this point, though, I do think that one of the things that we had hoped to do in the first two Alice games, and that we never really figured out, was having a more dynamic and interactive Cheshire Cat, meaning that a Cheshire Cat that you could press a button at any point, anywhere in the game, obviously within reason, and have the cat appear and then perhaps have interactions with either he lays some bit of wisdom on you or he's given, you're given the opportunity to maybe look up things that he's said in the past. We've not done that partly for technological reasons, because it's not really easy to have a character like the Cheshire Cat just spawn into the environment magically and appear in places that don't look dumb. You'd have to end up putting in sort of appearance points throughout the game, which is something we could certainly do. I think the other question was more from a narrative perspective. Is the Cheshire Cat a character who it can be summoned at will? I mean, I think his attitude is one of F off, I'm not coming to see you until I want to see you.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's a tricky one, isn't it? You know, people might want to trigger Cheshire and see Chesh whenever, but it doesn't really fit into his character as just being at your beck and call.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the hope here, the person who wrote this, is that you'd have an easy way to recall previous things the cat has said. And I think for that, having perhaps Alice with a notebook or some sort of log that those can be recorded in, and then you could just pull those up. And this is actually going to a point that was made in a recent post over on Patreon, which was the question of Alice's tasks, and then perhaps those are kept in some sort of a notepad or notebook. And that could contain not only the tasks that are ahead of her, but perhaps those that have been finished, or it might contain sort of the menagerie of characters that she's encountered. It might contain her screenshots, and it might contain her collection of lines from previous characters, or that she's encountered, like the Cheshire Cat.
I mean, you did have it in Madness Returns, where you had the collectibles that did open up new aspects you could look at, and that's pretty similar in most games, having, as you said, a logbook or something of that nature. Like in Bioshock, they had the audio phone, things of that nature. So having the ability to have a Chesh spam his talk as soon as you hear him repeatedly to make people happy might.
Yep. Well, so maybe this is a note to be made next to the Cheshire Cat's entry in the wiki, that being that we want to be able to recall the things that he's said, and then that entry should probably link to the blank page for us to fill in what it is that Alice keeps her records in. Is it a notepad? Is it a diary? Is it something along of that nature? Okay, so a diary, says Taylor. She thinks a diary would be great. Yeah, I actually do think a diary would be good. It creates kind of a cool bit of history for Alice. Of course, we'll have to come up with some explanation for why it doesn't come with her when she leaves Asylum. But that could be because it's not little girl Alice that leaves Asylum. It is sort of Shadow Alice that leaves Asylum and goes forward.
Spoilers. Did we say spoilers at the beginning?
I
think
assume that anyone who's listening to these things is going to know that there's spoilers. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you're following along, it's spoiler city here.
We really should make a note to say this at the beginning of everything we do.
Right.
What Kaiser Sose
one
was...
of our, so one of our insane children has just shared in the chat on Discord. This is inmate Chez or Chez. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to pronounce that, but this is a diary notebook. It says here that this is a design for the diary. And so this shows the front cover, the back cover, and would allow player to record this kind of information. This thing has a chaos symbol lock. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I think we can pass this concept along to our artists, and we could have them do up. This is something I know that Alex would enjoy doing, is to do up a diary along these lines. Okay. Yeah, so that's great work by inmate Chez. Thank you for sharing that. And unless anybody else has got anything to suggest in terms of the diary or Cheshire Cat's messages, we will move along. Point 2, someone has written here that Shadow Alice hinders Alice's project. If you move too close to the shadows, they reach out and grab you, and you have to fight to break free. Yeah, I think the first point here is one we've talked about in the past. That is that Shadow Alice does manifest as some sort of an actual character, and that we want to build up a lot of suggestions and hints that that character has been running along in front of us and setting up sort of obstacles or causing problems. That still requires quite a bit of, I think, detailing before we know exactly how that works. As far as the idea of the shadows reaching out and grabbing us, I'm not sure about that. I'm curious to hear what all of you think about that. You know, imagine that throughout the entire game, every time you get too close to a shadow, it tries to reach out and grab you.
Depending on the amount of shadows, that could get kind of annoying.
I could maybe see it
Yeah.
in one area at the very beginning and pull.
Right. You know, someone says like the darkness part in the Underwater of Madness Returns. Have to refresh my memory. That is that if you allow yourself to float down too far into the water, you get consumed by the darkness below. Is that right? I think that was Madness Returns, unless I'm thinking of a different game.
Sounds right.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the issues here would be, you know, populating the entire world with areas of shadow where this rule applies. And as several of you have said, that could be quite annoying that, you know, literally everywhere you go in the world, there's the potential for being bothered by shadow. The other issue is that we have talked about shadows, and we would, I think, want to use shadows for the stealth sections of the game. Also, we've said that going into shadow might trigger a sort of nervous reaction from Alice. So I think we need to decide, you know, in a case like this, is shadow an enemy or is shadow just a sort of environmental effect, and that we could have other effects come off of that?
For stealth, I'd
Yeah,
like
it
that.
could get confusing, couldn't it? If in one particular instance you're using the shadows for stealth, and then in another one you're being attacked by the shadows, wouldn't make for consistent gameplay. It feels like.
Yeah.
Shadows are your
But, you know,
friend.
back to the main point here, shadows Alice, hinder Alice's progress. I mean, I think leaving that alone, the idea though of shadow Alice, that, you know, shadow Alice bothers regular Alice as she moves through the game, that needs to be expanded on. That needs to be detailed. And, you know, it could be that she's laid traps. It could be that she has left signs of her passing in the shadows, you know, things like that. It could be that she's, say, for instance, we could make it so Shadow Alice goes around hiding critical clues or doorways or things like that in the shadows, which would then force, you know, the Alice that we're playing through as to go through and illuminate the shadows in order to reveal whatever it was that Shadow Alice hid. So I think that, you know, something along those lines could be quite interesting. Anyway, those kind of ideas we ought to just layer into the page about Shadow Alice, and then yeah, go from there. Somebody says, good point, Font Lord. What was the point that Font Lord made that was a good one?
I'm full of good points.
I was going to counter
it was
that,
the
but
inconsistent gameplay one.
yes, that was.
All right. Yeah. Truth Decay is asking, is Shadow Alice directly antagonistic, though? You know, I think, again, this is one of those points we need to explore. I could imagine that there would be times when we look up and we see a kind of shadowy character, you know, pull a lever, which drops, you know, attempts to drop an anvil on our head, just to use kind of a cliched illustration. But it could be not until later that we realize that the person at the lever was our shadowy self. And, you know, prior to that, we might have some misconception about what that character is. You know, there'd have to be some sort of unmasking or reveal later in the game. And, you know, I think the explanation for why, you know, little Alice can say, why have you been throwing all these obstacles in my way? You know, the most basic explanation for this is because you weren't ready, you know, to reach the end. You needed to overcome obstacles in order to grow, to become me. You know, I am you. I am my own father, Luke. And so I think that it makes sense that Shadow Alice is essentially trying to toughen herself up, that she's concerned that if young Alice, you know, goes through these trials too easily, she won't be prepared for what comes next. Somebody says here, Truth Decay says to Luca that Shadow Alice is a representation of the most damaged parts of Alice's psyche. That's not exactly true. I think that what we want to think of in terms of Shadow Alice, and this comes from the concept of your shadow self, that being the darker aspects of yourself. When you think about this, the main concept is one of integration. So when you're growing up, maybe you've been told that certain behaviors or certain things that you feel attracted to or interested in or excited by are negative, and that you should feel ashamed for those things. And so this can create a kind of schism within your personality where you may be attracted to something that your family or your culture has told you is immoral, but in fact, deep within you, that's something that you're very much attracted to or interested in. And until you integrate that shadow self, and obviously this doesn't necessarily go as far as like being an axe murderer, but there can be social norms that say would be against certain sexual preferences. And so your shadow self is oftentimes much dependent on culture and context, but it is an aspect of you that when you reject it, what I think Jung or Nietzsche would say is that the more you reject your shadow self, the stronger that shadow self becomes. The shadow self is also the sort of strong, more kind of powerful, or in some could be perceived as negative, but it's the aspect of yourself that can fight, that can stand up for itself. It's not meek, it doesn't roll over. And so, of course, in the context of Asylum, little girl Alice needs to embrace her shadow self. She must grow up. She must become a warrior. She must learn how to defend herself. She must learn how to attack. So the integration of the shadow self is what turns her into the warrior who can go out and overcome. So that's my thinking on Shadow Alice. It's not something necessarily negative, though, of course, to the view of a young Victorian girl, it's absolutely unladylike to wield a knife and stab things in the face, right? So in order for her to get to the point where she can be the Alice we know, she's going to have to integrate the shadow self.
From everything
Okay, so I hope that makes the...
it reminds me of Persona 4, because that's basically everything you just said. Like, all the characters would have to fight their shadow selves because they're there in the other world taunting them. And they don't want to accept that, and eventually they have to fight their shadow selves. And when they do, they gain
Right.
their persona and their confidence so that they can be able to fight and stand up for everything.
Well, there you go. So whoever developed that game has obviously been reading a bit of the Jungian psychology and personality architecture. Wendy in the chat here says that she would love to see a reunion of Shadow Alice and Child Alice. Well, that is what the ending of this game is going to be, is that as young Alice, Child Alice, fights her way through the story, she's being thwarted by or challenged by Shadow Alice, which is a sort of representation of her older self, the one that goes on into the later games. And what we have described is that in the final scene of Asylum, the two of them come face to face, and I think we've detailed some of what we think happens in that scene. We don't need to get into all that right now, but it definitely is the culmination of all of the threads of the narrative at the end of this game, is that the two of them do come face to face. Okay, yeah, I think Truth Decay, Lucas says to Truth Decay, yeah, what we've talked about is that it's actually Shadow Alice that travels on to AMA and AMR. And that's going to be one of the big reveals, is sort of that we, the player, have actually been and have been in control of Shadow Alice this whole time. So that's our Kaiser Soze moment. Okay, so let's go on now to point 3. Alice could have not only the ability to shrink to reach different areas, but she could also grow to reach certain areas or items. Sure, that's a pretty straightforward suggestion. And I think we've talked about this before, just in the sense of the challenges it creates to allow the player unlimited ability to grow and shrink for that matter. You do have to build the levels around it. One thought that just kind of springs to mind right now is that the grow ability could be one. If you imagine that Alice, you press that button and she grows, but let's say she only sort of doubles in height or triples in height, that could be her ledge grab. So there could be a ledge up above you that is 2 or 3 times taller than the top of normal Alice's head, but we have a button we press that essentially grows her to that height. She is then kind of level with the top of the ledge, and then on releasing the button, she lets go, or she grabs hold of the ledge and she shrinks up to get to the top of the ledge. So that's something we could do. Any thoughts on that?
Sounds good. I quite like the idea, like you said, instead of it, being like a climb, like you said, you grow, you grab onto it, and then you shrink. So I can just see that in my head now. It would look really cool playing that in game.
It would.
That would look really cool, yeah. And it doesn't, it's just a visual dressing for a mechanic that we're going to have anyway. And so it wouldn't necessarily break things. And of course, we could have areas where it does sort of like a Mario style head bump on items. If you grow up underneath something, it can break open a secret, or it can trigger a switch. I'm actually surprised we hadn't thought of that before. So that is something we should explore, is instantaneous growth, but it's only to sort of double her height, her normal height. So it doesn't get us completely out of control with respect to how that looks when compared to enemies. Now, of course, when you're holding down the grow button, maybe it makes it impossible for you to fire your weapons or to engage in any sort of like battle. You'd still be vulnerable to attack, but you wouldn't be able to attack enemies yourself. This is a question Alice on Elm Street has, is how would that work with enemies? Like, why wouldn't she just grow and crush enemies? Well, that's why I would say that, if we limit it to growing only to double her current, her normal size, then she wouldn't be that much bigger than her enemies, not big enough at least to just step on their heads. Also keep in mind that the way that we did the growing could be stylized. If I remember from the Disney movie, and let's be careful we don't get sued because I'm hoping this is also in the books, but I remember a visual of her neck becoming very long, very elongated. So the growth that we do, that grow button could be something where, well, we could even look at doing something where it's location specific. So maybe the grow button next to a ledge just gives her extremely elongated arms that reach up and pull her up. Perhaps a grow button underneath a secret makes her legs very long, so she's pulled up and she's able to press a button. Or so we could look at some context specific triggers and zones that affect the grow button in different ways.
Well, that'd be like in Tomb Raider, where different areas are highlighted to ability. So, having this wall where she grow, having this area where she shrink, it acts to make that.
What was that?
Yeah, I didn't understand anything that he said, but
all right, I'm sorry. My mic is I came in at last second, so no, what I'm saying is in Tomb Raider there are walls and areas that are highlighted for certain usage of abilities like the climbing, and so having it where this area can be used to stretch or there, highlights.
Right. Yeah, so Seafoam and Ancient Child are posting pictures from, I think, the Tennille illustrations in the original books where certain aspects of her have grown and certain aspects of her seem to be kind of relatively normal still. I think this is something we should explore. And to be clear, what I'm suggesting is that there's one button tied to the concept of grow, but the way in which she grows is dependent on the type of trigger that you're standing in front of. Obviously, it's an invisible trigger, the player, but we would highlight it visually with, say, a glowing or otherwise special ledge marking at the top of ledges that she could grow up to, grab, and then pull herself up, or glowing on the bottom side of objects that she could press and ram with her head, those types of things. I mean, we could even take this to the point where there's a context specific, you grow and she sticks her head through a wall and looks into the room on the other side in order to suss out, which lever to pull or what button to stand on, that kind of stuff.
I'm remembering back in time now, showing my age somewhat. But in Conker's Bad Fur Day, there was one button for all context events, wasn't there? So it's like you stand in front of a door, the context button opens it. You're standing under a ledge, the context button in this instance would make you grow. It's just like one button does all, depending on where you are and what you're doing.
That's correct. That's very correct. Yeah, why don't we look at that? So I don't know, maybe I don't know if it's in the wiki or where, but carve out a space specific to grow / stretch, and then also the idea of sort of context specific markings, zones, and actions that go along with that. And yeah, I think one button to rule them all, as Taylor says, is a good idea. That keeps things simple, and it keeps things fast paced, and we don't have to sit around trying to remember all these different combo buttons and stuff like that.
Works.
Okay, any other questions, thoughts, or feedback on the idea of shrink and grow? I mean, this was a pretty basic suggestion, but it obviously has triggered the possibility of doing grow, which I kind of thought previously we would stay away from. But now that I think about it for some reason, in this simple format, it's like, yeah, maybe we can figure out a way to make grow work. So anybody further thoughts on growing or shrinking? Okay. Point 4 here. Someone has suggested Inferno as the only power-up in game, but you could see Rage and Hysteria bosses that you could beat that are, I guess, generated by Shadow Alice. That then explains how Alice can use their powers in later games. Okay. I'm still a little bit unclear on what we've decided in terms of what the power-ups are in Asylum. It's not really fresh in my brain. Does anybody have any sense of where we left that?
We're still debating it.
We still have a lot of different systems in place that kind of need to be whittled down somewhat.
Yeah, I think so. I think we can't really comment on this very well until we decide what the power-ups are. I mean, this is a larger standalone conversation on its own. Trying to see, I'm looking at the wiki, and those of you following along on YouTube can click the link in the description below. There is a power-up section under gameplay on the wiki. This has got things like cakes, stuff rabbit, the clock for clock time, and of course there's some bits that Omri did, and I think Alex may have done some of these as well, but it's rage, anger, sorrow, sadness. So these are bottled up emotions. I don't know if you guys remember that, but we had said cheekily that perhaps her emotions are bottled up and you collect those. And so there are a couple of different emotional vials that were done up. This doesn't really have the power-ups in the sense of what this suggestion is referring to, though, which is rage and now I've lost the point. Oh, hysteria, rage, and inferno. So yeah, we need to kind of put a pin in this and then come back and figure out how to define these.
Well, I think the thing we kind of did talk about though was we had one in one game, one in the other. So having an iconic one for the third game makes more sense than just adding them all together.
Well, and we had said that the iconic one for this game was going to be Inferno, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, I like the idea that we have an iconic one for this game. And I understand the point the person that wrote this comment is making, is that let's at least show off Rage and Hysteria so we have some sense of the history of them and where they came from. That's okay with me. If we decide that our Alice in Asylum doesn't have access to those, but yet we somehow represent them. I think that would be cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Inferno is a fantastic looking image as well. So I think people would love to be raging through the game like that.
Yep, I agree. It seems we don't have a wiki page for Inferno Inferno yet. Is that correct? I'm looking at
That is
power-ups,
the
but there's not.
dress.
Yeah, it's just in the dress.
It'll be in the dress section.
Right. We might want to layer that into power-ups with a link back to that dress as well.
Okay.
And I think we probably need a pickup item, sort of a bit of art, a 3D model, which would trigger the dress, because I don't see that we've got anything like that drawn up just yet. Okay. Yep, I see the Inferno dress, and I know we all love the Inferno dress. I love the Inferno dress, and I'm happy if that's our one and only sort of killer power for the game. But still, we do want to link it up correctly in the wiki, and we do want to have some sort of pickup or some sort of thing that describes how that gets triggered. Is it low health? Is that she's collected enough of emotional vials? We should get that in there. Okay, going on to the next point, below point 4, so this is sort of 4.A. This is continuing on with that concept that perhaps Alice seals away Rage in a box and stabs Hysteria in the heart in order to defeat her. I'm guessing that this is in reference to meeting the physical sort of impersonation embodiment of Rage and Hysteria. So maybe what we need to describe here is that Shadow Alice is the one we're fighting, which is what the suggestion that's been made here is. But perhaps Shadow Alice in these formats is not recognizable yet as Alice or as Shadow Alice. And so we're fighting ourselves earlier in the game, but we don't realize it yet.
I think that's the point that they were making.
Yeah, exactly.
That could work.
In Alice, Rage was triggered with the Rage box, wasn't it? And in Madness Returns,
yes.
Hysteria was dependent on how many hearts of health you had left.
Well, yeah, it was a low health. It was a low health thing.
Yeah.
So the question would be, what triggers Inferno? What triggers? Now, obviously, Inferno being linked directly to her PTSD, to her trauma. I would imagine that maybe it's something to do with being reminded of the fire, something to do with being reminded of that night that her family died. So I think we've said in other places that is there the concept of death in the game? Does it sort of slowly build up around her? Does it seem like she's burning up or getting closer to death in that way?
Yeah, I thought we talked about having it where at least one of the abilities was as you collect things and then could unleash. That gives the player the power to say, okay, I want to just flip out and kill all the dudes. So I think having it where we're collecting emotions is probably the best option for this. And again, actually, that gives it a third way. Because first game was the Rage box. Second, it was when you're low on health. And this one, it's more control.
Yep, I agree. I like that idea that we collect for it and then we're able to manually trigger it when we want to. Alice on Elm Street asks the question that Rage was in the first game, but Hysteria wasn't. So should Hysteria be in this game? In other words, in Alice Asylum. How would you explain the absence of that power-up in American McGee's Alice in the first game? So I think that any kind of explanation like this, I mean, on a case-by-case basis, we can figure it out. But you imagine that Rage, upon defeat of Shadow Alice in the Rage format, the Rage box pops out, but it doesn't necessarily go into Alice's hands. It could fall over a cliff. It could, fly off into the sky. And the same thing is true of Hysteria, that, the spirit of Hysteria is released and it flies off. And so, never to be seen again, except, oops, yeah, we did see it, 2 games later. So we can always come up with some sort of a, maybe goofy But we can always come up with a narrative cover for, hey, we released that thing that you'll see 2 games from now. Now stop worrying about it, continue playing this game. Okay, moving on. I'm just looking at the comments that we have here in the chat, and Luca is suggesting that maybe when enemies are low on health, they get their own hysteria. And then he says, oh no. I don't know about that, but I think that the idea that other characters get hysteria could be interesting. Taylor says, I'm thinking white-colored enemies with the red bleeding eyes and enemies that look like they got a hold of a rage box. Yeah, I mean, both of these ideas are kind of fun. That, in this game, both hysteria and rage are sort of unleashed and freely floating around inside of the game world. And perhaps that even has something to do with, her ability to overcome the final challenges means essentially disabling those emotions because they're no longer useful. And so she's got to go find the rage generator and shut it down. And she's got to go find the hysteria fountain and shut it down. And actually, that kind of makes sense in the context of her overcoming her trauma, because as long as she holds on to rage, and as long as she holds on to hysteria and those flow freely around inside of this particular game world, she will not have the control necessary to move forward and confront the things that are coming after Asylum. So that could actually be kind of an interesting tie-in for all of this. It's like part of the goal of your existence in this particular chapter of the story is to get your rage and your hysteria under control, and that we show that physically. Look, the bad guys can flip into rage. It's impossible for you to get past the final stage until you've disabled that.
It would be fun seeing enemies having a second state.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that could be quite fun.
What does everybody think about that? Sort of the explanation for it. I think the visuals on that would be really fun.
Yeah, I think
it would. If there was, you could just imagine if you were fighting some kind of weaker enemy, and maybe each enemy has like a small % chance to trigger rage upon like death. You think you're just going around killing stuff, and then suddenly, like, boom, this tiny enemy just freaks out on you.
So it's like a frenzy.
Well, imagine also if there's a little bit of a delay before it triggers. So like, imagine that you deliver the killing blow to an enemy, and you start to move on to the next enemy, but then you see that the one you think you've killed starts sort of vibrating, starts shaking, and clearly like, oh shit, that thing's going to convert into a hysteria monster. I've got 3 seconds to hit it again and knock it down, right? So that could be actually really fun, because it provides the opportunity that any encounter with a group of enemies, out of that group, one of them always has the chance of sort of triggering hysteria if you don't pay attention and give him the double tap to make sure he stays down. Okay, Octo Chicken says, this is sort of like in Mass Effect 2, where the Collector General would take over enemies and they get super powered and cool. Katie and Taylor both say double tap. So yeah, I think the idea of a double tap to knock these particular enemies down could be a lot of fun. So why don't we pencil that in somewhere? And it seems like quite a lot has come off of this point number 4 that we can expand on, and there's some interesting ideas in here. Junk Steria, says Inmate Chez. I'm not sure where that conversation's going, but okay. We're going to move on now to point number 5. A late game power-up. Like, you've got Inferno throughout the game, and then suddenly at the end, in the final moment, when she's conquered her internal chaos, a new and even more powerful mode erupts that gives you a chance against the final boss. I think this is going to be something that's more or less defined in the sort of the way that the narrative wraps up at the end, because keeping in mind that the final boss is us. Alice's final boss in Asylum is the face-off between Shadow Alice, and I don't know yet how we think that's going to resolve, how we'd like to represent that. I mean, we've talked about the idea that Shadow Alice essentially comes back and says to young Alice, look, the thing is over. The fact that you've made it here means you became strong enough, means that I went on, and all you need to do now is lay down your arms. You just need to, relax. You're fine. And we've said maybe that means the player has to stop smashing buttons, or it could be that they do have some sort of a final fight. I think we're not quite ready to define that just yet, though.
I think
Any
when we were writing that, I forget who wrote it. It's based on if Inferno was the only power up that we have in the game. Once we get to the final boss, like in Omri's layout that he had, you guys wrote the harvest dress would be what you get at the final boss. So that would be like that extra new power up. It won't be Inferno for the last fight. It'll be the harvest.
right? Yeah,
I think this is a tricky one for me.
Well,
It's
we
like-
kind of talked about it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm a big fan of, at the end of the game, you get to see something like visually impressive that you haven't seen so far. Like, as a massive spectacle, I think it would look fantastic. On the other hand, I'm really not a fan of when games introduce brand new things that you haven't played for like 90% of the game, right at the end.
Well, I think
So-
this relates.
Yeah.
Again, I'm sorry. Is the Fierce Deity mask in Link's? I'm just not here today. I apologize. The Fierce Deity mask, where at the end you're basically super powered up to take on the final boss.
Yeah.
And then again, if we're doing the New Game Plus, you could then use that, new
Throughout
play.
the game. Majora's Mask is what you're thinking.
Majora's Mask, thank you.
Yeah, I'm a bit torn on this one just because it's so far into the game and we're not there yet in terms of writing that. And I kind of feel like this is going to be super critical. The last, say, hour or 30 minutes of the game is where we're going to have our "would you kindly" moment, our he's been Kaiser Soze all along moment. I'm not prepared to sort of suggest that there's a fight there even, or that the fight is something typical. So I would say we could keep this on a side somewhere. We don't have to get rid of the comment. I haven't fully formed this scene, the ending, in my head yet. I don't think any of us have. So
Gotcha.
maybe we put this aside and yeah.
Octo
Chicken Greg. Yeah, he says, I think it was my idea that the final actual boss, perhaps before even confronting Shadow Alice, is some huge spectacle showdown, a just more amped up version of Inferno. So say it doesn't turn off, it does 3 times more damage, etc. As American is saying, obviously it can wait till how the end works is determined. Yeah, I think, having a pre-confrontation with Shadow Alice battle would make sense. That there is some sort of big, nasty. We're going to need this. We're going to need in the case of the narrative. We're going to need the ultimate bad guy, at least what we think is the ultimate bad guy, and we're going to want to build ourselves up and work and fight and level up until we get there, and then we're going to beat it. And it can be in that scene that there is some. Well, not to upset Martin, maybe it's something we've acquired several steps previously, so you've had a chance to play with it. But yeah, I mean, that final fight, she's going to have to be at her peak, and then we're going to defeat that big bad boss, and then we're going to walk through the door, and there's going to be Shadow Alice, and she's going to be like, "You're not done yet." So if we want a traditional big boss battle at the end, we can do it, and we'll have to define what that character is that we've essentially been told since the beginning. You're going to have to overcome that thing, but then when we get to the end, it's like, haha, great, you defeated that, but that's not the real enemy, right?
This isn't my final form.
This isn't even my final form.
Okay. Right. So we are actually at point 6, and we are getting close to coming up on 1 hour here. So why don't we wrap this up with the final point here? And so point 6, somebody has suggested if the doll maker is running the weapon/toy shop, the music in the shop could be remixed in a more upbeat version of the doll maker's theme. I think that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, something jingly and cute. So in parentheses, the person says, same note structure, just a cheery and wonderful idea, but the underlying menacing tone of the song would still be there. Yeah, I think that's great. You walk into that shop and it's sort of like, was that toy store that they played It's a Small World, FAO Schwartz. Yeah, I mean, that would actually explain why the doll maker went insane. I always thought that if I was forced to work at FAO Schwartz and listen to that same effing song over and over and over again for 8 hours a day, I would go and murder a bunch of children too. I think we've just found the doll maker's motivation for these games. He was forced to work at FAO Schwartz as a child. And so he's decided to kill children and turn them into toys. It all makes sense now. All right. That is the final point in the gameplay suggestion. In case does anybody have anything else they want to add in today? If not, we'll wrap this up. All right. So it looks like we did actually, I'm surprised. There were 6 points here. Some of them seem to go off target a bit, but they all resulted in some interesting conversations. So we'll get this stuff wrapped back into the wiki. And again, for those of you who have been following along over on YouTube, this was a live crowd design session, which we hosted on our Discord server. If you would like to learn more about our Discord server, consider becoming a patron. The links to that are in the description below, along with the links to the wiki where all the design work that we're doing on Asylum can be found. We do this design sessions, we try to do these once a week. And so if you're interested in joining us, please do hit the links below. And I think that would bring us to the end for today. So a big thank you to our mods and our insane children who joined us. And I do hope that we will see you all again next week. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Like waiting and
All right.
take care.
Bye, everyone.